Episode 5, Hierarchy and Power in Renaissance Europe, an AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions. Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm Miles Thatcher, and I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little wiped out today. We had a long run after school and I've got a quiz tomorrow, so yeah, we're pushing through.
That actually might be the perfect mindset for today's episode, Miles.
Really?
Because what we're looking at today is a society that, on the surface, seems like it's changing. New ideas, new wealth. But underneath, there's still a lot of structure, a lot of pressure, a lot of expectations.
Okay, so Renaissance Europe wasn't just people painting and reading books?
Not even close. Today, we're going to look at two big questions. What did social hierarchy look like in Renaissance Europe? And how were stronger states beginning to form?
All right, so kind of like who had power and how that power was organized.
Exactly.
Okay, so when we say hierarchy, what exactly do we mean?
A hierarchy is a system where people are ranked, socially, economically, politically. In Renaissance Europe, there was what historians call a hierarchy of wealth, meaning your money mattered more than it had in the Middle Ages, but it didn't replace older systems of status. And there's another idea shaping how people understood this structure, the Great Chain of Being.
That sounds kind of intense. What is that?
The Great Chain of Being was a way of thinking about the world as a fixed, ordered hierarchy created by God. Everything had its place. God at the top, then angels, then kings, nobles, common people, animals, and so on.
So like, everything is ranked and it's supposed to stay that way? That kind of reminds me of last year's world history class, the caste system in India, like where people are born into a social level, and it's really hard to move out of it.
That's actually a really strong comparison, Miles. Both systems organize society into fixed levels and suggest that those levels are natural or even divinely ordered. Exactly. The idea was that this order was natural and unchangeable. So when people looked at social hierarchy, kings above nobles, nobles above commoners, they often believed that was part of a divine plan.
Which makes change complicated. Because if hierarchy is seen as part of God's design, challenging it can feel like challenging the natural order itself.
So money mattered, but it wasn't everything?
Right. At the top, you still had the nobility, families with titles, land, and long-standing social prestige. They valued something called honor, which was tied to reputation, family name, and behavior. In places like Florence, families such as the Medici used wealth from banking to gain influence, even if they weren't traditional nobles.
So like, old money versus new money?
Exactly. Because rising up beneath them were wealthy merchants, bankers, traders, who had a lot of money, but not always the same social status.
And in many cities, especially in Italy, Florence, Venice, and Milan, these wealthy merchants formed what we call merchant oligarchs, small groups of powerful families who dominated political life. In Florence, for example, the Medici family, especially Lorenzo de' Medici, played a major role in shaping politics and culture.
Oligarchs meaning rule by a few?
Exactly. These were not democracies. Power was concentrated in the hands of a small, wealthy elite.
So even though things are changing, it's still not equal.
Not even close. The Renaissance opens up some opportunities, but society is still very structured.
Okay, but what did that actually look like for people? Like, how would you know where you stood?
Oh, you would know. Society made it very clear. One way was through laws called sumptuary laws. Cities like Florence and Venice passed detailed sumptuary laws regulating clothing, jewelry, and even wedding celebrations.
What?
Sumptuary laws regulated what people could wear, eat, and display based on their social status.
Wait, like the government tells you what clothes you're allowed to wear?
Exactly. Certain fabrics, colors, or jewelry were reserved for the nobility.
It was about making hierarchy visible. You could look at someone and immediately know their place in society.
So there's no pretending to be something you're not.
Exactly. And this connects back to honor. Your behavior, your appearance, your family, all of it reinforced your position.
Where do women fit into this?
At every level of society, there was a gender hierarchy, a system where men held more power than women.
Across all classes?
Yes, women were expected to be subordinate to men.
And during the Renaissance, people began debating this. Historians call it the debate about women, or the querelle des femmes.
So like, People arguing about whether women should have more rights?
In part, yes. Writers were arguing about women's nature, women's education, and whether women were actually less capable than men or had just been denied opportunity. One of the most important names here is Christine de Pizan, who wrote in defense of women and pushed back against the idea that women were naturally inferior. Later on, women such as Cassandra Fedele also argued that women should pursue learning, even in a culture that tried to confine them to the household.
And on the other side, a lot of male writers defended traditional roles. Even humanists who supported education often thought women should study religion and morality, not rhetoric or politics.
So even the people who sounded progressive still had limits.
Exactly. That's what makes the debate so important. It shows that Renaissance thinkers were questioning old ideas, but it also shows how strong the old hierarchy still was.
So this is like the beginning of the conversation, but not really the change yet.
That's a great way to put it, and it sets us up for next episode.
Okay, so while all this is happening socially, what's going on politically? And how are these new monarchies actually different from what we saw in the late Middle Ages?
That's the key question. In the late Middle Ages, power was much more decentralized. Nobles controlled land, armies, and local authority. What we're seeing now is rulers trying to take that power back and concentrate it in the monarchy. This is where we see the rise of strong monarchies, rulers working to centralize power. In France, England, and Spain, rulers are trying to reduce noble independence, restore order after violence, raise revenue more efficiently, and make the monarchy stronger than it had been in the late Middle Ages.
Centralize meaning bring power under their control?
Exactly. In France, Charles VII rebuilt the monarchy after the 100 Years' War. He created one of Europe's first permanent royal armies, which meant the king no longer had to depend entirely on feudal nobles for military force. Then Louis XI of France pushed even further. He used that stronger monarchy to curb noble independence and to expand French territory. Burgundy was brought under French control in 1477, and other territories like Anjou, Maine, and Provence were added as well.
So France is getting bigger and more centralized at the same time.
Exactly. And then in 1516, Francis I made the Concordat of Bologna with Pope Leo X. That agreement let the French king choose bishops and abbots in France, which meant the monarchy gained more control over the church inside the kingdom.
Which is a big deal, because religion wasn't separate from politics. Controlling church appointments meant controlling influence, money, and loyalty.
Okay, so France is building power through armies, territory, and even church control.
Right, England looks a little different. There, the big problem in the 15th century was disorder among nobles, especially during the Wars of the Roses between the houses of York and Lancaster, which lasted from 1455 to 1487. After that conflict, Henry VII worked to rebuild royal authority. He relied heavily on the royal council, used institutions like the Star Chamber to keep nobles in line, and tried to avoid expensive foreign wars.
Wait, why avoid wars?
Because wars are expensive, and in England, the king often had to work with Parliament to raise taxes.
Okay, I've heard of Parliament, but what actually is it?
Parliament was a representative body made up of nobles and commoners that had to approve certain taxes. So unlike in France or Spain, English monarchs couldn't always act completely independently when it came to raising money.
Which means the English monarchy is getting stronger, but it still has to share power in ways other monarchies don't.
So England is centralizing too, but with limits.
Exactly. Spain is another major case. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile married in 1469, and while Castile and Aragon kept their own laws and institutions for a long time, the two monarchs pursued a common policy and strengthened royal power together. They pushed nobles off the royal council and replaced them with trained officials, often men educated in Roman law. They expanded royal authority over the church, completed the Reconquista with the conquest of Granada in 1492, and used the Spanish Inquisition to enforce religious unity.
So part of state building in Spain is also religious unity.
Yes, and that came at a huge human cost. The monarchy investigated conversos, or new Christians, and in 1492 expelled practicing Jews from Spain.
And you can actually see how this growing state power connects to everyday life. When I was chaperoning a student trip through Spain, we visited Medina del Campo, one of the major trade fairs in Castile. The monarchy regulated trade there, collected revenue, and tied economic activity directly to royal authority. It's a really concrete example of how centralization worked in practice.
So it's not just laws and armies, it's also controlling money and trade.
Exactly. So in Spain, France, and England, the monarchy is getting stronger, but each state gets there in a slightly different way.
That's way more detailed than just saying nation-states formed.
It is. State building is a process, not a switch that flips overnight.
Okay, but if this is happening, why doesn't Italy become a unified state?
Italy remains fragmented, divided into competing city-states like Florence, Venice, Milan, and the Papal States. These states often competed with one another, sometimes even hiring mercenary armies called condottieri.
Cultural innovation doesn't always lead to political unity.
So while Spain and France are centralizing, Italy stays divided.
Exactly.
Okay, so let me see if I've got this. Society is still structured with a hierarchy of wealth, nobles and merchants, and visible status through laws. There's also a gender hierarchy, even with debates beginning. And politically, rulers are centralizing power through armies, taxation, and control of trade.
Excellent summary.
Next time in episode 6, we're going to explore whether the Renaissance improved the lives of women. Thanks for listening to the Once and Future Present. Outro music